Captain Marcus Wellington had served the royal family for 15 years without a single blemish on his record. His uniform was always pressed to perfection, his boots polished until they gleamed like mirrors, and his salute was crisp enough to cut glass. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, he would position himself at the palace gates, ready to greet King Edward with the respect and dignity befitting a monarch. But something had changed in Marcus over the past few months. His younger brother James had returned from the war in Afghanistan, but not the same man who had left 2 years earlier. James came back broken, haunted by nightmares, struggling to find work, and abandoned by the very government that had sent him to fight. The promises of support for veterans had turned out to be empty words, and Marcus watched helplessly as his brother spiraled into depression and poverty. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Marcus had just finished his night shift and was heading home when he saw James sitting on a park bench, still wearing his tattered military jacket, counting the few coins he had managed to collect from passers-by. The sight of his decorated hero brother reduced to begging on the streets filled Marcus with a rage he had never experienced before. As Marcus stood there watching his brother, memories flooded back. He remembered how proudly James had enlisted, how their family had celebrated his service, how the king himself had given speeches about honoring those who served their country. Yet, here was James, forgotten and discarded like yesterday's newspaper. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He sat in his small apartment staring at his Royal Guard uniform hanging in the closet. For the first time in his career, he questioned everything he had believed about duty, honor, and service. How could he continue to serve a system that treated veterans like his brother with such callous disregard? The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Marcus's mood perfectly. He dressed in his uniform as always, but his heart felt heavy with the weight of his decision. As he walked through the palace corridors, his fellow guards nodded respectfully, unaware that their trusted colleague was about to make history. King Edward was scheduled for his regular morning inspection of the guard. It was a routine ceremony that had been performed countless times, a tradition that symbolized the loyalty and dedication of those who protected the crown. Marcus took his position in the lineup, his face betraying no emotion, though his mind was racing. The king approached, resplendent in his ceremonial attire, flanked by his advisors and security detail. One by one, the guards snapped to attention, their synchronized salutes creating a display of military precision that had been perfected over decades. Marcus could hear the sound of his own heartbeat as the king drew closer. When King Edward reached Marcus's position, time seemed to slow down. The king paused, waiting for the customary salute that would demonstrate Marcus's loyalty and respect. But Marcus remained perfectly still, his arms at his sides, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable, then shocking. The other guards glanced nervously at each other, unsure of what they were witnessing. Palace officials exchanged worried looks, while the king's security team tensed, ready to intervene if necessary. Never in the history of the Royal Guard had such a blatant act of defiance occurred during a formal ceremony. Marcus felt every eye in the courtyard upon him, but he refused to waver. This wasn't about disrespect or rebellion for its own sake. This was about his brother, about all the forgotten veterans who had served their country only to be abandoned when they needed help most. His silence was speaking louder than any words could have. The king stared at Marcus for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable, and several guards shifted uncomfortably in their positions. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would have consequences far beyond this single moment. Finally, the king spoke, his voice carrying across the courtyard with quiet authority. "Captain Wellington, is there something you wish to say?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus realized that his moment of truth had arrived. Everything he did next would determine not only his own fate, but potentially impact the lives of countless others who, like his brother, had been forgotten by the system they had sworn to serve. Marcus felt his throat tighten as the king's words echoed across the silent courtyard. Every instinct told him to snap to attention, to offer his apologies and pretend nothing had happened. But the image of his brother James, sitting defeated on that park bench, gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I cannot in good conscience salute a crown that has forgotten those who bled for it." The gasps from the assembled guards were audible, and he could see palace officials whispering frantically among themselves. King Edward's expression remained impassive, but Marcus caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe curiosity. "Continue, Captain," the king said simply, his tone giving no indication of his thoughts. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back now. "My brother James served in Afghanistan for 2 years. He earned 3 medals for valor, saved the lives of 5 fellow soldiers, and came home with wounds both visible and hidden. Today, he sits on park benches begging for enough money to buy a meal because the promises made to our veterans have been broken." The courtyard had grown, so quiet that the sound of rain beginning to fall seemed deafening. Marcus could see some of his fellow guards nodding slightly, and he realized he wasn't alone in his feelings. Many of them had family members or friends who had served and struggled upon their return. "The royal speeches speak of honor and sacrifice," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "But what honor is there in abandoning those who answered their country's call? What sacrifice means anything if those who make it are forgotten the moment they're no longer useful?" King Edward listened without interruption, his hands clasped behind his back. The rain was falling harder now, but no one moved to seek shelter. This moment felt too important, too historic to break away from. "Every morning for 15 years, I have saluted this crown with pride," Marcus said, his voice beginning to crack with emotion. "But I cannot salute a symbol that has become hollow, that represents empty promises and forgotten duties. My loyalty lies with the people who serve, not with the system that betrays them." A young guard named Thomas, who stood 3 positions down from Marcus, suddenly stepped forward. His movement caught everyone off guard, and for a moment it seemed he might arrest Marcus on the spot. Instead, he slowly lowered his own saluting hand and stood at ease, joining Marcus in his silent protest. The ripple effect was immediate and stunning. One by one, more guards began to lower their salutes. Some did it quickly, as if afraid they might lose their nerve, while others moved slowly, deliberately, making their choice with careful consideration. Within minutes, nearly half of the royal guard stood in solidarity with Marcus. Palace security moved closer, unsure how to handle this unprecedented situation. The head of security, Colonel Harrison, looked to the king for guidance, his hand resting on his radio. One word from King Edward, and Marcus and the others would be arrested immediately. But the king raised his hand slightly, a gesture that stopped Colonel Harrison in his tracks. Edward's eyes swept across the guards who had joined the protest, then returned to Marcus. "You speak of broken promises, Captain. Tell me specifically what you believe should be done." Marcus was surprised by the question. He had expected anger, punishment, immediate dismissal. Instead, the king seemed genuinely interested in hearing more. "Veterans like my brother need real support, Your Majesty. Not just words and speeches, but actual programs that help them transition back to civilian life. Mental health services that don't have year-long waiting lists. Job training that leads to real employment. Housing assistance that doesn't get lost in bureaucratic red tape." "And you believe the crown has failed in these responsibilities?" the king asked. "With respect, Your Majesty, I believe the entire system has failed. the crown, the government, the military leadership. We send young men and women to war, and when they come back broken, we treat them like damaged goods that need to be hidden away. The rain was soaking through everyone's uniforms now, but no one suggested moving the conversation indoors. This raw, honest exchange felt like it needed the open air, the natural elements, to strip away the usual pomp and ceremony that often obscured the truth. King Edward was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from guard to guard, taking in the faces of men and women who had served him faithfully but now stood in open defiance. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone present. "Captain Wellington, I want you to accompany me to my private study. Bring 2 of your fellow guards with you. We're going to have a conversation that should have happened long ago." He turned to Colonel Harrison. "Cancel my remaining appointments for the day, and I want a full report on veteran services prepared by tomorrow morning." As the king began walking toward the palace, Marcus felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, but instead of facing immediate punishment, he was being invited into the king's private chambers. Whatever happened next would determine not only his own future but potentially the fate of thousands of veterans who had been forgotten by the system they had served. The king's private study was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen in his 15 years at the palace. While the public rooms were filled with formal portraits and ceremonial decorations, this space felt personal and lived in. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, comfortable leather chairs were arranged around a fireplace, and family photographs sat on the massive oak desk. Marcus had chosen Thomas and an older guard named Patricia Davies to accompany him. Thomas was young but thoughtful, known among the guards for his intelligence and integrity. Patricia was a 20-year veteran who had seen 3 different monarchs and commanded respect from everyone in the service. King Edward gestured for them to sit in the chairs facing his desk, while he remained standing, looking out the rain-streaked window at the courtyard where the unprecedented scene had just unfolded. The silence stretched on for several minutes before he finally spoke. "My grandfather served in World War II," the king began, his back still turned to them. "Not as a royal figure making ceremonial visits to troops, but as a young officer in the Royal Navy. He saw action in the North Atlantic, lost friends to German submarines, came home with stories he never wanted to tell, but memories he couldn't forget." He turned to face them, and Marcus was struck by how different the king looked here, away from the formal ceremonies and public appearances. The weight of his position seemed more visible, etched in the lines around his eyes. "After the war, my grandfather struggled. He had nightmares, drank too much, couldn't hold a conversation without his hands shaking. But because he was royal, because he was supposed to be strong and dignified, no one talked about it. The family pretended everything was fine, and he suffered in silence for decades." Patricia shifted forward in her chair. "Your Majesty, many of us have seen similar struggles in our own families. The reluctance to seek help, the shame of admitting that the war left scars." The king nodded. "When I became king, I promised myself I would never let the crown become disconnected from the reality of what our service members face. Yet here we are, 15 years into my reign, and a decorated guard captain tells me I've failed in that promise." Marcus felt compelled to speak. "Your Majesty, I don't believe you personally have failed, but the system, the bureaucracy, the way promises get lost between speeches and action, that's where we've lost our way." King Edward walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "This morning, before our encounter in the courtyard, I was reviewing veteran suicide statistics. Do you know how many former service members took their own lives last year?" The number he shared made all 3 guards wince. It was far higher than any of them had imagined. "And do you know how many of those deaths could have been prevented with proper mental health support, job placement assistance, or simply someone who cared enough to check on them regularly?" The king continued. Thomas spoke up for the first time. Your Majesty, in my neighborhood, there's a veteran who lost both legs in an IED explosion. He waited 18 months for a proper prosthetic fitting. 18 months of being essentially housebound because the system moved too slowly. Tell me about your brother, the king said to Marcus. I want to understand exactly what he's been through. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he began to describe James's situation. He talked about the nightmares that woke James screaming at 3 in the morning, the job interviews that went nowhere because employers saw his military service as a liability rather than an asset, the medical appointments that were scheduled months in advance while his pain continued daily. He applied for disability benefits 8 months ago, Marcus continued. The paperwork alone was overwhelming, forms that seemed designed to confuse, rather than help. Medical evaluations by doctors who had never seen combat, who questioned whether his injuries were real or severe enough to warrant assistance. Patricia nodded knowingly. My nephew went through something similar. 3 appeals before they acknowledged that his hearing loss was service-related, even though he had clear documentation from military doctors. The king had been taking notes throughout their conversation, filling several pages with careful handwriting. What specific changes would make the biggest difference? He asked. Marcus had thought about this question many times during sleepless nights worrying about his brother. First, the bureaucracy needs to be streamlined. One office, one point of contact. One person responsible for seeing each veteran's case through to completion. No more shuffling between departments while people suffer. Second, Thomas added, job training programs that actually connect to real employment opportunities. Not generic courses, but partnerships with companies that commit to hiring veterans. Patricia contributed her thoughts on housing assistance and medical care, drawing from decades of observation and her own family's experiences. As they talked, Marcus began to realize that this conversation was unlike anything he had expected when he made his decision not to salute. The king wasn't defensive or angry. Instead, he seemed genuinely shocked by some of what he was hearing and determined to understand the full scope of the problem. Captain Wellington, the king said finally, your brother's situation is unacceptable. But more than that, it's emblematic of a system that has lost sight of its most fundamental duty. We ask people to serve, to sacrifice, to put their lives on the line for their country. When they answer that call, we owe them more than empty ceremonies and forgotten promises. The king stood and walked to the window again, watching as the rain continued to fall on the courtyard where everything had changed just hours earlier. I'm going to ask you to do something that may be more difficult than refusing to salute, he said without turning around. I want you to help me fix this. Not as a royal guard, but as an advisor who understands what needs to be done. Are you willing to take on that responsibility? Marcus stared at the king in disbelief. Just hours earlier, he had been prepared to face court-martial, imprisonment, or at minimum the end of his career. Now he was being offered a position that could actually make a difference in the lives of veterans like his brother. Your Majesty, I'm not sure I'm qualified for such a role, Marcus said carefully. I'm a soldier, not a policy expert or administrator. King Edward turned from the window, a slight smile crossing his face. Captain, this morning you did something that career politicians and policy experts have failed to do for years. You spoke truth to power, even when it cost you everything. That kind of courage is exactly what this problem needs. Patricia leaned forward. If I may, Your Majesty, what exactly are you proposing? The king moved to his desk and began spreading out documents. I'm proposing we create an entirely new approach to veteran services. Not another government department that gets bogged down in red tape, but a direct action initiative that answers to the crown. Captain Wellington would head a team with real authority to cut through bureaucracy and get things done. Thomas looked skeptical. With respect, sir, we've heard promises of reform before. What makes this different? What makes it different is that you 3, and others like you, will be in charge of it. Not career bureaucrats who've never served. Not politicians looking for good publicity, but people who understand the problem from the inside. The king pulled out a leather portfolio and began sketching out an organizational chart. Here's what I'm thinking. We established the Royal Veterans Initiative, with direct funding from the Crown Estate. No waiting for parliamentary approval, no budget battles, no political interference. Marcus studied the rough outline. This would give us the authority to override existing departments when they're not serving veterans properly. More than that, the king replied. It would give you the authority to create entirely new systems when the old ones are too broken to fix. If the current disability review process takes 18 months, you design a new one that takes 18 days. If job training programs aren't connecting veterans to real employment, you build partnerships directly with companies. The scope of what was being proposed was staggering. Marcus thought about his brother James, still sitting on park benches, still fighting nightmares, still struggling to find his place in a world that seemed to have forgotten him. What about oversight? Patricia asked. Parliament won't be happy about the Crown taking direct action on domestic policy. King Edward's expression grew serious. Let me worry about Parliament. When they see the results when veterans suicide, rates drop and employment numbers rise, when people like James Wellington are getting the help they deserve, the politics will take care of themselves. Over the next 2 hours, they worked out the details of what would become the most ambitious veteran support initiative in the country's history. Marcus would lead a team of 12 people, all with direct experience in either military service or veteran advocacy. They would have offices in every major city with the authority to establish emergency response teams for veterans in crisis. But there's one condition, the king said as their planning session was winding down. Everything we do must be transparent. No hiding behind royal privilege or government secrecy. The public needs to see exactly how their veterans are being served, and veterans need to know they can trust us. Thomas raised an important point. What about the other guards who joined the protest today? They put their careers on the line, too. The king had already considered this. Anyone who stood with Captain Wellington today will be offered positions in the new initiative if they want them. Those who prefer to remain in the Royal Guard will face no punishment. What happened? Today wasn't mutiny. It was a wake-up call that I desperately needed to hear. As they prepared to leave the study, Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and terror. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but for the first time since watching his brother struggle, he felt hope. Your Majesty, he said as they reached the door. There's one more thing. I'd like my brother James to be part of this team, not because he's my brother, but because he understands what we're trying to fix in a way that none of us can. The king nodded immediately. Of course. In fact, I'd like to meet him. If he's willing, I'd like him to tell me his story directly. Not as a king receiving a report, but as someone who needs to understand what we've put our veterans through. The 3 guards left the study with detailed plans to review and a meeting scheduled for the following week. As they walked back through the palace corridors, Marcus realized that everything had changed, not just for him, but potentially for thousands of veterans across the country. Word of what had happened in the courtyard was already spreading throughout the palace staff. Some looked at Marcus with suspicion, others with admiration. But Marcus found he no longer cared about their opinions. He had a job to do now, a mission that mattered more than personal reputation or career advancement. That evening, Marcus sat in his brother's tiny apartment, explaining everything that had happened. James listened in silence, his expression cycling between disbelief, hope, and skepticism. You really think this will work? James asked finally. You really think the king means what he says? Marcus looked at his brother, seeing both the decorated soldier he had once been and the broken man he had become. I think we're about to find out. But James, for the first time since you came home, I believe things can actually change. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first stars were becoming visible in the clearing sky. 3 months later, the Royal Veterans Initiative had transformed from an ambitious idea into a functioning reality that was already changing lives. Marcus had thrown himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even him, working 18-hour days to establish offices, hire staff, and create the streamlined systems they had envisioned. The first major test came when Sarah Mitchell, a former Army medic, walked into their London office in desperate circumstances. She had been waiting 14 months for a disability review while living in her car, unable to work due to injuries sustained in a roadside bombing. Under the old system, her case would have been just another file in an endless stack. Under the new system, Marcus personally reviewed her case within hours of her arrival. By the end of the day, temporary housing had been arranged, emergency financial assistance had been approved, and a comprehensive medical evaluation was scheduled for the following week. 3 weeks later, Sarah had permanent housing, ongoing medical care, and had started a job training program in cybersecurity. Stories like Sarah's were becoming common, but they were also revealing the true scope of the crisis. For every veteran they helped, 3 more walked through their doors with similar problems. The demand was overwhelming, but so was the satisfaction of actually being able to provide real solutions. James had indeed joined the team, and his insights proved invaluable. Having lived through the bureaucratic nightmare himself, he could identify problems and propose solutions that others might miss. More importantly, his presence gave hope to veterans who felt forgotten by the system. When veterans see that someone who went through what they're going through is now in a position to help, it changes everything, James explained to Marcus one evening as they reviewed case files. It tells them that their struggles matter, that someone understands. The king had kept his promise about transparency. Monthly reports were published showing exactly how many veterans had been helped, how much money had been spent, and what results were being achieved. The numbers were impressive. Veteran unemployment in their service areas had dropped by 35%, suicide rates were down, and satisfaction surveys showed approval ratings that government programs rarely achieved. But success brought new challenges. Parliament members who had initially been skeptical were now demanding to know why the Crown was more effective at solving domestic problems than elected officials. Some praised the initiative, while others complained about constitutional overreach. The real test came when veteran advocates from other countries began requesting meetings to learn about their methods. Marcus found himself presenting their model to delegations from Canada, Australia, and the United States, all of whom were struggling with similar problems in their own veteran populations. During one particularly memorable presentation to American officials, a retired general asked Marcus about the key to their success. "What we did differently," Marcus explained, "was put veterans in charge of veteran services. We didn't create another layer of bureaucracy managed by people who had never served. We gave authority to people who understood the problems from personal experience." The initiative's success was also creating positive changes within the traditional government departments. Seeing the Royal Veterans Initiative's efficiency, several departments began adopting similar approaches, streamlining their own processes, and hiring more veterans for key positions. However, the most meaningful moment came when Marcus received a letter from a veteran's widow. Her husband had taken his own life 2 years earlier after being denied disability benefits 3 times. She wrote, "My husband died believing that his service meant nothing to his country. Because of what you're doing now, other families won't have to go through what we went through. You're giving veterans back their dignity, and that's worth more than all the money in the world." The letter reminded Marcus why he had refused to salute that rainy morning. It wasn't about disrespecting the Crown or making a political statement. It was about ensuring that service and sacrifice were met with genuine support rather than empty ceremony. King Edward had maintained regular contact with the initiative, often making unannounced visits to their offices to meet with veterans directly. During one such visit, he sat with a young veteran named David, who had lost his leg to an improvised explosive device and was struggling with depression. "Your Majesty," David said, "I used to think that my sacrifice didn't matter to anyone. But knowing that you cared enough to create this program, knowing that Captain Wellington and his team fight for us every day, it's given me hope again." The king's response was simple but powerful. "Your sacrifice has always mattered, David. We just needed to do a better job of showing you that." As Marcus watched this exchange, he realized that his act of defiance had accomplished something he never could have imagined. It hadn't just created a new program or helped individual veterans. It had fundamentally changed the relationship between the crown and those who served, creating a bond of mutual respect and genuine care that went far beyond traditional ceremony. Initiative was now being studied by military academies as a case example of effective leadership and social responsibility. Marcus had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, sharing the story of how one moment of principled defiance had catalyzed systemic change. But perhaps the most satisfying result was the change in his brother James. The broken man who had sat on park benches was now a confident advocate who helped other veterans navigate their darkest moments. He had found purpose again, and in doing so had reclaimed the dignity that war and neglect had tried to take from him. As Marcus looked toward the future, he knew there was still enormous work to be done. But the foundation had been laid. The systems were working, and most importantly, veterans across the country knew they had not been forgotten. Royal Guard Story. Part 6-1. Year after the morning that changed everything, Marcus stood once again in the palace courtyard. But this time the scene was entirely different. Instead of a formal military ceremony, the space had been transformed. For the first annual Royal Veterans Recognition Day, an event that celebrated not just service, but successful reintegration into civilian life. Hundreds of veterans filled the courtyard, many of whom had been helped by the Royal Veterans Initiative. Sarah Mitchell was there with her cybersecurity certification, having just landed a senior position with a major tech company. David, the veteran who had lost his leg, had completed a degree in counseling and was now helping other wounded veterans cope with their injuries. Most importantly to Marcus, James stood beside him, wearing a suit instead of his old military jacket, confident and proud. He had been promoted to Deputy Director of Veteran Mental Health Services and had become a nationally recognized advocate for military families. King Edward approached the microphone that had been set up in the center of the courtyard. Unlike the formal ceremonies of the past, there was no rigid protocol today. Veterans and their families sat in comfortable chairs. Children played on the grass nearby, and the atmosphere was one of celebration rather than ceremony. "A year ago," the king began, "a brave guard captain taught me that true loyalty sometimes requires the courage to challenge what we think we know. Captain Marcus Wellington refused to salute not out of disrespect, but out of a deeper respect for what service truly means." The crowd turned to look at Marcus, who felt a familiar tightness in his throat. But this time, it was from pride rather than anger or frustration. "Today, I want to share some numbers with you," the king continued. "In the past 12 months, the Royal Veterans Initiative has helped over 15,000 veterans find employment. Veteran suicide rates have dropped by 47% in the areas we serve. Disability claim processing time has been reduced from an average of 16 months to 3 weeks. The applause was thunderous, but the king raised his hand for quiet. "But statistics, impressive as they are, don't tell the real story. The real story is in the faces I see before me today. Veterans who have found hope again, families who have been reunited with the people they love, communities that have been strengthened by the contributions of those who served." Marcus watched as several veterans wiped away tears. These were people who had been forgotten, dismissed, or ignored by the system for years. To see them honored and celebrated in the highest circles of power was emotionally overwhelming for everyone present. "I also want to acknowledge," the king said, "that our success here has inspired similar initiatives around the world. 7. Countries have now adopted versions of our model, and the results are proving that when we treat veterans with the dignity and support they deserve, everyone benefits. Thomas, who had become Director of Veteran Employment Services, leaned over to Marcus. "Can you believe this actually worked? Sometimes I wake up thinking it was all a dream." Patricia, now heading veteran housing initiatives, overheard and smiled. "The best part is that it's still growing. Every month we help more people, and every month we get better at what we do." The King's speech continued with announcements of new programs, expanded mental health services, increased partnerships with universities for veteran education, and a new initiative to help veteran entrepreneurs start their own businesses. But the most significant moment came when the King called Marcus to the microphone. "Captain Wellington, would you like to address our guests?" Marcus had spoken at numerous conferences and meetings over the past year, but addressing this crowd felt different. These weren't policymakers or academics. These were the people whose lives had been directly affected by his decision to refuse a salute. "A year ago," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I made a choice that I thought might end my career. I was angry, frustrated, and feeling helpless as I watched my brother suffer. But what I learned is that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to stand up and say that the status quo is not good enough." He paused, looking out at faces that reflected his own journey from anger to hope. "Every person here who has struggled with the system, who has felt forgotten or abandoned, who has wondered if their service mattered, you are the reason we do this work. You are the reason we get up every morning determined to do better." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. "But more than that," Marcus continued, "you are proof that with the right support, with genuine care and respect, there is no limit to what veterans can achieve. You are teachers and entrepreneurs, counselors and innovators, parents and community leaders. You are the best of what our country has to offer." The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and Marcus saw his brother James wiping away tears of pride. As the formal program concluded and people began to mingle, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. It had started with anger and frustration, but it had been sustained by hope and determination. Most importantly, it had been successful because it put veterans at the center of the solution rather than treating them as problems to be managed. "King." Edward approached Marcus as the crowd began to thin. "Captain, I have one more request. I'd like you to consider expanding the initiative internationally. We've had requests from 12 countries wanting to implement similar programs." Marcus smiled. "Your Majesty, a year ago I was a palace guard who refused to salute. Today, you're asking me to help reform veteran services around the world. It's almost too much to believe." "Believe it," the King replied, "and more importantly, accept it. The world needs what we've built here." As the sun set over the palace courtyard, Marcus stood with his brother James, watching veteran families enjoying an evening that celebrated both service and successful transition to civilian life. The transformation that had begun with a single act of principled defiance had grown into something that was changing lives around the world. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked. "Refusing to salute that morning?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to find the courage to do it. But I suppose everything happens when it's supposed to happen." They stood together in comfortable silence. Two brothers, whose lives had been transformed by the decision to speak truth to power and the unexpected response from a king who chose to listen rather than punish. Around them, the sounds of celebration continued, a testament to what becomes possible when courage meets compassion and when service is met with genuine support rather than empty ceremonies.